The years leading up to the First World War had begun to feel heavier, a bit more serious. Yet that optimism, and perhaps naive feeling, was still present within the liberal framework. In the first decade of the 20th century, a fundamentally new form of liberalism would begin to proliferate philosophically. Writers like L.T. Hobhouse and T.H. Green would argue that liberalism up to that point had only been considering negative liberty, that which was an absence of state interference. They would argue that there was a neglected counterpart, that these negative liberties were meaningless if a worker were starving or uneducated, as if a worker were in such a state, having the liberty to do what he wished was functionally no different than if he had been constrained by the state, because either way, he was very limited on what he could do. Thus, this school of thought would propose positive liberty, that the state must actively intervene to give citizens the capacity to achieve their potential. Britain's liberal governments of the early 20th century would tend toward this outlook, at least to some extent. Prime Ministers H.H. Asquith and David Lloyd George would move for reforms that aligned with this vision. In 1909, the People's Budget would be passed, creating sweeping new systems, including old age pension, national insurance, and free school meals. This was laying the groundwork for yet another new relationship between state and people, laying the seeds for the welfare state. So the argument went that if citizens were to be truly free, to truly operate within a liberal system, then they must be given everything that they need to fully reach their potential so that they would not be bound by material constraint. Governments on the continent would take notice, yet to great extent their systems remained more traditional. Despite how recognizably modern and liberal Europe, and particularly the English world, was becoming, the Western world going into the 1910s could still be understood in the frame of old Europe. That was until events conspired across the continent to push Europe into the Great War. The badly weakened Ottoman Empire would recede from the Balkans, even losing territory to the Italians. Ethnic conflicts in the Balkans would escalate, and the Russians, just off the back of a defeat against the Japanese, would find themselves taking the role as the global protector of Slavs. Crisis would emerge in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Archduke assassinated. The Germans would find that if they wished to maintain their status as a powerful empire, they must involve themselves. London would face a gold and currency shock, London's systems coming under pressure, and Britain knew that for the empire to maintain, at least at the strength it desired, then it too must become heavily involved in continental affairs once again. Ultimately, Germany would enter into war against France, fighting on behalf of the Austro-Hungarian geopolitical situation. They would be fully aware of the necessity for Russia to become involved, and wishing to move quickly to address a potential two-front war, the Germans would take military action in Belgium. Thus, Britain's political and financial elite, who already knew that for the sake of the empire, they would need to resolve things to their satisfaction, would obtain a casus belli and become co-belligerents against the Germans and Austrians. The Italians, recognizing the possibility of taking back lands from Austria that they had long claimed, would as well find this brewing enormous war pressing to them, all while the Ottomans fought for survival. Events had broken just perfectly to make the First World War an enormous, brutal, and costly affair. The state of mechanization in Europe ensured that fighting would be protracted and based upon attrition strategies, with new mechanized weaponry, aviation, and chemical weapons, making the fighting in the trenches an entirely new horrific form of warfare that nobody was anticipating. The First World War required total economic mobilization. In both the United States and Britain, governments would take total control over the economy, fixing prices, nationalizing railroads, and conscripting labor. The American President Woodrow Wilson had found himself much more closely integrated with the elite of Britain. Figures around Wilson's White House were closely associated with the 19th century imperial vision of an Anglo-American foreign policy establishment, one which sought to bring the United States into Britain's fold under an Anglo-Saxonist view that Americans and Britons should be engaged globally to the same ends. Over recent decades, the American and British elite had increasingly intermarried, and associations like the Pilgrim Society had formed. There was a growing movement for the integration of the London imperial elite and American institutions, certainly within the foreign policy sphere, but increasingly on the financial one. And ultimately, under Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned under the phrase, "He kept us out of war," the United States would find itself in the fields of France and Flanders, fighting in the trenches alongside Britain, all while New York became a major war financier. Exposed to many of the emerging British views, Wilson had become an early progressivist. He would argue against representational democracy, and argue against the dominance of the legislature, believing instead that a technocratic elite class, with expertise over their domain, would be the proper form of governance for a society. This viewpoint believed much more in state social engineering, and in the notion of a permanent expert class. There were indeed two deep Fabian elements that had entered into this progressivist sphere, and as Americans and Britons were able to for the first time see what a fully controlled, state-engineered command economy looked like, many began to wonder if such a top-down economy could persist in peacetime. The First World War changed something very deep within the Western psyche. The sheer horror of the war would lead to a profound and ubiquitous disillusionment. The liberal belief in inevitable linear progress would come to a screeching halt, as now too many had seen just how horrific the darkness man was capable of creating, in fact, was. It was clear just how much could be destroyed, just how much suffering could be inflicted, and thus the optimism had ended. New philosophical and artistic movements would begin to emerge, many under the broad bucket of modernism. The new way of thinking was much more cold, much more cynical, and the romanticism that had defined the latter 19th century was gone. Many were wondering what it all meant, and if it meant anything at all. And thus, going into the 1920s, the Western world was to be unrecognizable from what it was when it had first entered into the war. The 1920s looked radically different on each side of the Atlantic. In Britain and Europe, the fallout from the war was devastating. Enormous losses, infrastructure damage, and horrendously degraded economies. Yet in the United States, as interest rates were artificially low in an effort to protect the gold supply of London, and because it was the only functional economy still around, the economy would charge ahead, consumer credit would boom, and stock market participation would climb. In America, the 1920s was a time of excess, consumption, materialism, and optimism for the roaring economy. Yet beneath the facade of the Great Gatsby-esque fun that was underway, there lurked a certain nihilism. In part, the excesses and partying of this era were a coping mechanism in response to the horrors of the war. In the 1920s, the progressive movement would grow, particularly propelled by figures like John Dewey, solidifying within American intellectual consciousness, yet it would also take a hit politically after the end of Woodrow Wilson's term as president. This progressive view that was forming believed in continuous social experimentation and universal education. It was very much a proponent of a social engineering worldview, and yet maybe the most subtle element of progressivism is also its deepest: the belief in the abstract metaphysical object of progress. That there is linear directionality to human social evolution. That through the wise social engineering of a technocratic elite, people can be brought up to this heightened state. This made progressivism inherently utopian. That if the experts could tinker enough, then they could eliminate human want and backwardness. Yet many were becoming quite uneasy with this idea. Many were very unhappy with the command economy of the wartime, objecting to the government intrusion that they had endured. And this, to a large extent, is the fundamental divide within liberalism. one which quite closely ties to the ideas of negative and positive liberty. On the one side, you have classical liberalism, libertarianism, and traditional American liberalism. While there are substantial differences between these worldviews, they all believe that fundamentally, the point of liberalism is negative liberty, the assertion of individual rights, with social practices like freedom of speech as one of the primary concerns of this worldview. Their fundamental belief of liberty is that liberty means that social institutions cannot impose upon you, that you have a fundamental, inalienable right to do as you please and be left alone. The main upside to this worldview is that as it is so individualistic, it is also individually empowering, leading to quite entrepreneurial and frontiersman ethoses. Yet its main risk is atomization. It runs the risk of breaking down social bonds that are necessary for groups to maintain cohesion. At its extreme, this way of thinking would state that nobody can make any claims of another, potentially jeopardizing the existence of social institutions and the belief in social and interpersonal responsibilities. Yet, on the other hand, there is the positive liberty worldview that ethoses like progressivism, socialism, British New Liberalism, and Fabianism share. Perhaps the main upside to this worldview is that it can be quite strong with collective action, and it as well addresses problems of the commons, believing in ideas of social services like schools, public fire departments, and social safety nets. Yet its main risk is that at its extreme, it becomes extremely authoritarian and totalitarian in highly counterproductive ways. This line of thinking is where you get philosophies like communism, believing that rights are things that people are owed, and not things that people are entitled to be free from. As well as progressivism is fundamentally utopian and holds true to the fundamental liberal assertions, it can easily make the argument of universal claims, which leads to the conclusion that there is something that a society owes the entire world. Beginning from the starting position of the blank slate, it can be quite easily reasoned that the only differences between those within your state's purview and everyone else is mere circumstance of birth, material condition, and the social constraints that were artificially forced on them. Therefore, what a truly liberal society should do is focus itself on the material conditions of the world's poorest and elevate them to a state of liberal society. This hadn't quite emerged in the 1920s, but such ideas were beginning to form, particularly in academia, and as we see today, it can spiral out of control. As when you believe in a metaphysical object of abstract progress at the end of history, you can go to extreme lengths to bring about the liberal end state, where everyone has total positive liberty. In 1922, Walter Lippmann would publish Public Opinion. He would argue that modern society had become too complex for people to comprehend, and that therefore public perception and understanding must be managed by a technocratic elite. He would argue that this must be done by manufacturing consent with systems of hyperrealities, simplistic simulacra of reality that could be easily understood by common people. Dealing with the actual complex affairs would be done by the technocratic elite who were capable of comprehending such things, while the public at large would be told simplified stories that serve the purpose of the state, their information filtered by a media apparatus that would tell them only what they needed to know, so that they would behave in an orderly manner conducive to the goals of the liberal state. This technocratic ideal that was emerging had its roots back in the 19th century, although to some extent has emerged throughout all of history, and it became very popular amongst the elite of the West, and particularly amongst academics, who believed that they were uniquely capable of understanding the true realities of the world, and that therefore they understood the interests of the common people better than they themselves did, and were thus entitled to act and make decisions on their behalf. Now you can see how this would be very alluring to someone like a professor, or perhaps a high-ranking government bureaucrat, as this is a perfect moral justification for, I don't actually need to tell you anything, it is actually good if I lie to you, and me having total control over your life and making decisions for you is actually a moral good because I understand your interests better than you. To some, this is a quite seriously held belief, although quite often, people have a way of constructing worldviews that serve them. And if you're someone who is put in a position where you could have more power, on the grounds of, I'm doing it for everyone else, then you can see why it would be quite easy to talk yourself into a worldview like this. Around the same time, we would see the birth of the modern advertising industry, particularly with the works of Edward Bernays, who would create a profession that he would term public relations. He laid the groundwork for so much of modern advertising and propaganda. Back during the First World War, the British state had become heavily involved in the media, using its propaganda arm, Wellington House, to gain almost total control of the information that Britons were receiving, and particularly as transatlantic cables were cut, in turn becoming the only real source of information about the war for Americans. This rise of increasingly sophisticated propaganda, and the worldview that supported technocratic belief, melded quite well together. Bernays would draw from the ideas of Sigmund Freud, who was his uncle, and so these early forms of propaganda science would be heavily based on ideas of group psychology and emotional manipulation, attempting to influence people through mechanisms like appeals to authority, fears of ostracism, the desires to be loved or attractive, and largely attempting to manipulate the sense that people had of fitting in or being excluded, something which remained heavily in practice to today. At the same time in Britain, the Liberal Party, who for a long time had been one of Britain's major two parties, began to become displaced as working class movements became increasingly powerful. The Labour Party would solidify a position in government. The Labour Party would marry socialism and labor unionism together to create a very powerful movement, particularly after the passage of the Representation of the People Act in 1918. The political dynamics were changing rapidly with this greatly expanded voter base, and thus socialism, labor unionism, and working class interests were beginning to become increasingly powerful forces within the political apparatus. Yet the sheer destruction and social disillusionment, particularly in continental Europe, would open up increasingly radical viewpoints to a much greater extent than had existed before the war. During these years, the Russian Revolution and Civil War would coalesce into the formation of the Soviet Union, creating a large and powerful communist state in Europe. At the same time, Germany was in particularly abysmal shape following the war. It would experience a string of extreme economic crises. Its monarchy and government would collapse, and it was bound by extremely onerous terms to the Versailles Treaty which had ended the war. Internally, the society was extremely divided, and many new ideas would proliferate, all pushing against the liberal center, attempting to hold on to some semblance of the German state that had existed before. In 1923, the Institute for Social Research would be founded at Goethe University, Frankfurt. The new academic institution would be funded by the wealthy Marxist donor, Felix Weil. Upon the Institute's inauguration, Karl Grünberg would become the director. It would be a research and teaching institute based upon Marxist ideology, or if you're a Marxist, the absolute, true, and unquestionable science of Marxism, with its primary goal being the cataloging of European labor movements. There was growing support for communism in Germany, and the Soviets would lend support, attempting to spread the communist revolution across the world. Yet at the same time, many other movements would begin to emerge, those supporting the restoration of the monarchy, more traditional conservatives who wished to return to the nobility structure that had been there before, as well as many new radical reactionary movements, including some associated with the working class, such as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which we will revisit. The German nation had become the Weimar Republic, named for the city in which the new government was formed, and it was in disarray. There was profound social deterioration, widespread poverty, widespread addiction, depression. Some, particularly tourists from wealthier countries, would find cities like Berlin quite fun, enjoying the extreme libertinism. Yet to many in Germany this was unacceptable. They viewed themselves as a degraded and humiliated people, and thus the perfect conditions were present for a great many to seek radical change. Across the West, everything seemed bleak. The economies of even the victorious nations were just barely limping along. The governor of the Bank of England and the governor of the New York Fed had to coordinate to keep the gold supply in London, as Britain, which believed that entering the war would give it an opportunity to preserve the strength of its empire, would find itself in a much worse economic state of affairs following the war. Yet, as the 1920s neared a close, interest rates in the United States would be forced up. Gold and capital investment would be brought back to Europe and London, and the one economy in the Western world that had been roaring ahead would grind to a screeching halt, with America's stock market crashing in 1929. And as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the indications of recovery would vanish, and all hope of getting back to prosperity eliminated, as Europe, Britain, and the United States would sink into severe economic depression. The 1930s would begin, and across the West, everything looked dark. The sheer economic hopelessness of the 1930s would force ideological galvanization. In the United States, Franklin Roosevelt would become president, birthing an entirely new liberal framework in the country. In an effort to deal with the economic crisis, he would put forth a set of policies, in aggregate, the New Deal. His outlook drew heavily from progressivism. This new Rooseveltist New Deal liberalism would to great extent be the birth of modern American liberalism that has existed since. During the 1930s, as the Great Depression worsened, the sheer sense of hopelessness was staggering. Many were giving up on liberalism and capitalism altogether. New Deal liberalism would create a new liberal defense for capitalism. It would draw heavily from the economic theories of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, which proposed that the government should be heavily involved in the economy by utilizing fiscal policy, using deficit spending to spur on a depressed economy, and paying off debt and becoming more restrictive during times of expansion in order to cool down the economic growth, in theory, eliminating boom-bust cycles. The New Deal would as well see heavy regulation, with a rapid increase in the role of government administration. Largely, in both the United States and Britain, the core belief was that liberty is preserved by adapting the nation's institutions in order to address economic shocks while safeguarding the constitutional process. It believed that the state should be something like a civil referee, that the government had to be involved in order to protect civil liberties. This did not reach the point of a command economy, though it believed heavily in regulation and stimulus efforts like large public works projects, and was a major proponent of the positive liberty idea that there must be a social safety net. This philosophy was in keeping with the traditional liberal belief in private property and market structures, yet amending the belief with the idea that for these to be preserved, the government had to intervene fiscally and via regulation. Under the New Deal, sweeping new regulations would be implemented, Social Security would be created, new guarantees for labor bargaining rights enshrined, new social safety nets created, and there would be vast fiscal stimulus and unemployment efforts, particularly through public works projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority. In large part, this was done in order to address the economic crisis. Yet another major motivator was to keep people from turning to the other ideas that were emerging in Europe, particularly in the 1930s, the fascist philosophy of the Italians and the communist ideas of the Soviets. On the continent, radically new regimes would form in Italy and Germany, and though there are substantial differences between the two, there were some quite common threads. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's government would rise, based upon a philosophy of fascism. Meanwhile, in Germany, under extreme pressure, the government's centrists would invite the National Socialist German Workers' Party to a seat at the table. Yet ultimately, the NSDAP, under Adolf Hitler, would take the entire table. ultimately instantiating a one-party state. In common, the two regimes believed that the ultimate reality of a people resides within the organic collective. In the case of the Italians, this was the state. Everything in the state. Nothing outside the state. Nothing against the state. Meanwhile, from the German point of view, this was the people itself, existing as a biological and metaphysical entity. Unlike the communists, both systems would retain a system of private property ownership, but in both cases, such ownership would be subordinated to the state. In Italy, as a fundamental philosophical claim, as the state is the ultimate entity, and in the case of Germany, more as a practical reality for economic recovery and rearmament, and later for the war effort. In order to address the economic crisis, they would engage in rearmament programs, mobilizing the economy in order to stimulate production and reduce unemployment. Many in the United States and Britain would take notice, seeing the sheer efficiency of these mobilization efforts as inspirations that could possibly be replicated, at least in some form, back in the English world. Both nations would be driven by a very deep sense of pride for their nations. In the case of Germany, for the German people, that organic collective that grew out of lineage and heritage. While in the case of Italy, for the civic structure of the Italian state, being a part of the Italian civic entity. The Soviets, on the other hand, had perhaps the most radical departure. They believed that history was dictated entirely by material reality, all of which was part of an economic class struggle. They believed that humanity went through different stages of social existence, at each stage engaged in a struggle of the classes, tribal war chiefs oppressing tribal peoples and accruing the wealth to themselves, feudal lords and kings abusing the serfs and taking their wealth, and the capitalist elite abusing the proletarian masses and stealing the prosperity that was rightfully theirs. They believed that communism was the ultimate social order that would yield the utopian end state, where there would be no more material want, no more social classes nor distinction, nor even the need for a state at all, as everyone would exist in a state of harmony, equitably sharing the prosperity, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. They believed that the Soviet Union was the vanguard state, the first to rise in what would be the global revolution of the workers against the capitalists, that they were at the forefront of the entire world stepping into the new age of communism. They considered civil liberties to be bourgeois illusions, manipulative arguments that existed only to perpetuate the improper stealing of assets on the part of the capital elite, retaining the bourgeoisie on their side with such notions, and browbeating the workers. The Soviet Union would engage in enormous collectivization and industrialization campaigns, collectivizing vast swaths of farmland, and building up enormous factories, bringing all production under the state. In their philosophy, they argued that the state was temporary, that everything was to be collectivized under the state, yet ultimately, that as the Soviet new men were created, re-educated to Marxist consciousness, that the state would ultimately be unnecessary, as people would naturally exist in a state of collectivization and equality. Yet as for the 1930s, the state would be present and powerful, the system highly authoritarian and totalitarian, engaged in internal hunt for counter-revolutionaries. Often what gets brought up is the incongruity between the communist notions of equality and the raw power of the Soviet state giving extreme power to its leadership. They would argue that the leadership as well were just filling a necessary role, and that the state was ultimately temporary anyway, that the new Soviet elite were more like overseers of the transition to the communist utopia. But there is something very interesting about how the notion of equality was viewed between these different regimes, these different philosophies. Anglo-liberalism believed in civic and legal equality. This philosophy did not concern itself with the outcomes of all individuals, yet instead their relationship to the state and the opportunities presented. Anglo-liberalism believed that everyone should be treated equally under the law, and that nobody should have special privileges with respect to their relationship with the state. Yet they rejected the idea that everyone should have the same level of wealth, arguing that this would necessitate an extremely authoritarian society, and that it would also fundamentally go against the liberal notions of liberty, as if one's actions were independent of one's outcomes, then there was no actual agency in one's actions. To ensure common outcomes from different actions meant engineering the lives of every person in the society, creating a totalitarian system. And so the Anglo-liberals, even though some were secretly a little interested in what the Soviets were doing, were by and large quite alarmed at the growth of communism in Eastern Europe. The National Socialists and Fascists, on the other hand, thought of the people as the unit of consideration. They were much more concerned with the rights of peoples, in a way that Anglo-liberalism was not. The Italians were concerned with the civic entity of those within the Italian state, the Italian polity, while the Germans were concerned with the German people, those who, whether or not the state existed, were German by birth, as Germanness was inherent to all ethnic Germans. Both would argue that there must be consideration on this level, that there is unique moral value to a collective people. While they certainly didn't disregard the liberal notions of individual rights, nor individual equality fundamentally, they believed that those were secondary to those of the collective. In Germany, for example, individual Germans would have individual rights, individual private property, and there was a belief in individual equality and fairness amongst Germans, yet that those would have to be subordinated to the German people as a whole. Perhaps one may need to give up property, or one may have to give up individual liberty if it were necessary for the needs of the German people. At the same time, too, this of course meant that these considerations were not extended to peoples who were not German, the Germans being the entity of consideration. When looking at this era, many people categorized the different philosophies into three buckets of the liberals, the fascists, and the communists. Yet there was much more disagreement between the different countries at the time. The United States under Roosevelt was driven by a philosophy of pragmatic instrumentalism. This held that the state ought to be an active and flexible instrument in the pursuit of the alleviation of suffering. Yet while Britain had been beginning to move more in this positive liberty direction, it still existed within its framework of 19th century Liberal Imperial Conservatism. Many within Britain's philosophical elite were quite weary of Roosevelt's New Deal, seeing the sheer scale of government involvement and regulation as a slippery slope to socialist totalitarianism. The dominant strain of liberal thought in Britain melded Locke and Smith's liberalism with Burkean conservatism. Particularly under the prime ministerships of Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, there was much more of a value placed on structural continuity, balanced budgets, and the preservation of the empire and its interests. To some extent, the United States was becoming more socialist, and there were certainly Marxist elements within the Roosevelt administration, though to call Franklin Roosevelt a Marxist himself would be too far an overstatement. Nonetheless, there was an influence, and as well in both the United States and Britain, and particularly with the rise of the Labour Party, Fabian ideas had gotten a quite noticeable grip. The divide between the Germans and the Italians is quite interesting. At its core, German National Socialism was rooted in Volkish nationalism, placing the greatest moral weight on the German people, those who were ethnically German, bound by heritage and lineage. To be German was a biological reality, as ethnically you are who you are. They would view the state as an expression and means of securing the interests of the people. They would create a synthesis of liberal social Darwinism, something which had grown up in progressivist thinking and had roots back in the Victorian era, believing that the biological and social health of the population should be actively overseen. In the United States, this would take the form of the eugenics movement. There would be many facets to this, which would touch things like education and housing, but in large part would be based around institutionalization and the control of reproduction, believing that certain traits, such as those associated with criminality or low cognitive function, should be excluded from the population. The Germans would adopt this to policies of population-level hygiene, including institutionalization, sterilization, and in some cases, euthanasia. They would begin programs to curtail drug abuse, spread nutritional and dietary education, with a very sizable anti-smoking campaign. And as well, a large component of this would be programs based around marriage and reproduction, creating government education and propaganda, and later direct laws designed to ensure the ethnic purity of the population, such as restriction on intermarriage. So many within the liberal framework attempt to understand things as ideologies. As liberalism is inherently propositional, liberals will tend to assume that everyone else is operating in a propositional framework, that fundamental differences in belief come from people accepting different propositional notions. Yet a very deep component of the German movement was something quite beyond proposition and ideology. It was a very deeply rooted sense of pride and love. So much of it was emotional and metaphysical, inspiring people with music, aesthetics, stories. As the country had become so badly degraded following the First World War, something that people really sought was just to be able to feel proud of themselves again, to no longer feel denigrated by the rest of the world. The Italians, on the other hand, believed in absolute statism. The fascist philosophy under Benito Mussolini derives its origins from the works of Giovanni Gentile, believing that the state ought to be the ultimate moral and spiritual reality, the ultimate entity of consideration. The Italian fascists, and in particular Mussolini himself, would heavily mock German racialism, with Mussolini referring to it as scientific nonsense. He believed that Italian citizenship was defined by spiritual and cultural submission to the Italian state. He would say that race is a feeling, not a reality, asserting instead that the state was the reality. He would assert that Hitler's biological obsession is a dangerous barbaric myth that threatened European civilization. Yet, by 1938, Italy had become economically and militarily dependent on the Germans, and Mussolini had to cave and placate the German regime, publishing Manifesto on Race, rather cynically endorsing the German worldview, which in turn would alienate the Catholic Church and many of the population. Today, many people think of the ideologies of fascism and communism as though they are the polar extremes, the furthest points in the range of possible philosophies, constructing a notion of left and right. But this is all very bounded within a liberal framework, and indeed even the philosophies of fascism and communism themselves, though extremely modified, as well exist in that framework. If you step back for a moment and try to analyze things in terms of that left and right, with fascism and communism as the extremes, just where would you place Confucian bureaucracy? How about traditional Vedic philosophy? How would the practices of the Amazonian tribes slot into that schema? They wouldn't. And that's because for as wild and radical as they seem, they still retained a common liberal lineage. What we think of as left and right only work if you assume a liberal framework. Yet once someone leaves that framework, there's no way to conceptualize that person within the schema. For example, today, there will be people with wildly conflicting ideas. People who come from labor unionism, supporting highly socialized systems. People who are quite libertarian, even anarchic, and people with very traditional notions, all alongside someone who might be quite statist. Yet within the liberal framework, all could be considered to the right, even though for many of them, their ideas are demonstrably left. And the reason is that liberal thinking assumes propositional philosophy. It assumes that the ideas that people think are all inherently propositional, as they are in liberalism. Yet, as people begin to accept notions that are not propositional, some that are felt, embodied, or inherent, then this system breaks apart, without a clean way to conceptualize the not liberal. Perhaps someone who on policy matters aligns with the furthest socialists on almost every metric. Yet because such person is not liberal, the liberal will reflexively assume that this must be a person to the extreme right, though that person may have nothing in common with the furthest right liberal. This all illustrates the point that for people who have lived within the liberal framework for their entire lives, it can be extremely difficult to think outside of it. Where would you place someone who believes in traditional pagan Scandinavian collectivism with an elective chieftainship? That person would doubtlessly sound extreme right and extreme left simultaneously to the liberal, attempting to categorize said person on the liberal spectrum, yet nothing would quite fit. Within the liberal spectrum, it can be really quite difficult to actually say what is the left and what is the right. These notions come from French liberalism and France's Assembly. Broadly, our conceptualization centers around things like hierarchy and traditionalism on the one hand, and social collectivization and progressive efforts on the other. Yet these will routinely fall apart, as there can be quite right-wing collectivism and anarchic leftism. Yet what seems to be the only true constant that allows this schema to have any usage at all is openness, and how one feels with respect to borders and differentiation. The only real difference that reliably holds within this schema is that one is quite sensitive to ideas of differentiation, borders, separateness, and by extension hierarchy in organization, while others are averse to such things, believing in fundamental openness in a policy context in opposition to national borders, in opposition to the definition of nation itself. This can manifest on the personal level, with things like openness to experience, and how rigid one's sense of an in and out group are. And here we begin to get at the real core of what divided these nations. On the one hand, the Germans were concerned totally with the German nation, their ultimate geopolitical goal, securing the position of the German nation and obtaining dominance in the East, while for the Soviets, their goal was international in scope, with a vision of overthrowing capitalism globally. These are quite clean and clear inverses. One is concerned with the bordered nation, that which is within it, the in-group, while the other's primary concern is everything that is outside, the international, the entire world. This is a divide that has been fundamental throughout all of liberalism's history, and indeed very much today, with perhaps the most fundamental disagreement today being whether we should concern ourselves globally, whether we should operate on global systems in a global economy, concerned with the affairs of all people, operating under global frameworks, with global institutions, ultimately one day with the goal of eliminating nations themselves, seeing no difference between people within a nation and without it. Yet the rising counterforce are those who are concerned with the nation, those who are within one's country, believing that a nation should be put first, that borders should be enforced, and that there is fundamentally different moral consideration that one owes to those who are a part of his people and those who are not. This divide between the within and the without, the opened and the closed, the differentiation and the non-differentiation, are very fundamental metaphysical differences that are by far not unique to liberalism, and yet they are so fundamental that ultimately every philosophical system will at some point run into a form of this fundamental question. And that's really what was happening in the 1930s. Things had become so abysmal in Europe that people were beginning to ask questions of their philosophical assumptions in ways that they never would have considered before, engaging in the realm of very deep metaphysics and metaethics, in a way that people just don't do when everything is stable and prosperous. On the metaphysical level, another very fundamental deep divide expressed between the Germans and the Soviets was the deep disagreement between Volkish essentialism and materialist determinism. The German Volkish essentialism believed that history was fundamentally driven by an eternal biological struggle. This philosophy would assert that there are biological and spiritual realities inherent to all people, that there are immutable qualities within everyone, and that the deep conflict that has driven human development is that which exists between biological groups. This was a quite spiritual, quite deep, and really quite human worldview. The Soviets, on the other hand, had something fundamentally opposite. They believed that the driving force behind history was an eternal material class conflict. They didn't believe that there was anything inherent to anyone. They believed that there were no biological realities that really mattered, and that anyone could be engineered into the new Soviet man. This gets at another one of those truly fundamental arguments that humans have been having throughout all of history, the debate between nature and nurture. The Germans believed in nature, that people are born with immutable inherent characteristics, that one could not choose to be German or choose not to be German. They simply were or they were not, just as one simply is tall or short, whether one's hair is red or black, man or woman, that there are some things that people are just born as, and that these things matter, that they are the deepest parts of one's being, for these are what form kinship, what makes someone who they are, and what makes a people. The Soviets rejected this, believing that everything that mattered about a person could be socially engineered. They believed in nurture, that the circumstances of one's birth were irrelevant, and that one could be made to become anything, that what made someone a new Soviet man was their being nurtured into becoming one. This argument certainly persists today, with many within the liberal sphere attempting to assert increasingly purist nurture positions, arguing that all these differences are entirely socially mediated constructs, and that by virtue of one's mental state, one could metaphysically become anything that one chose. Really, neither purist point works. There are certainly biological realities. There are certainly things that are inherent to all people upon their birth. People are part of lineages. People are part of families, part of their ethnic groups. People are born with a biological reality. They are born with certain dispositions and mental states that are inherent to themselves. And yet if one were to take the position that everything that mattered to a person was immutable at birth, then that would entirely eliminate the role of things like upbringing, that which someone was exposed to, what someone was taught. There are attributes which people develop throughout life, and attempting to demand that all consideration be given only to nature or only to nurture always leads in misunderstandings, failures, or worse. Nonetheless, there have always been ideologues who have asserted that only one matters, and particularly within the context of the nation, this becomes extremely pressing. Here the fundamental question is who can be a part of a nation. If you believe entirely and solely in nature, then it is those of the ethnic group, the kinship network which share common lineage, that one is born into the nation, and that is all that matters. And there is quite a lot of truth to this, as when one puts ideology and social engineering aside, these are realities, and these are how people do seem to operate. Yet if one were to be a purist on this point, then one would then have to assert then there is no room at all to integrate anyone from the outside. The problem that emerges here is that throughout history, human groups have operated by bringing in members. That even back in very early human societies, people would marry into different tribes, tribes would merge, and later on people would migrate between kingdoms. Closing the door on that entirely runs the risk of alienating some potentially quite productive new members. Yet if one takes this openness to its extreme, then one begins asserting that the lineage and ethnos don't mean anything at all, a position which is increasingly evidently untenable. Here one would believe in inviting in everyone and anyone. With this liberal assumption, none of the biological, lineage, familial, nor cultural differences matter, and so all societies should be open, inviting in anyone who wishes to become a part. The thinking goes that the differences don't really matter, and so any group should be able to coexist with any other group. Yet in practice, this becomes quite disastrous, as indeed those differences assert themselves, and as we see throughout history, conflict emerges. The last of these very fundamental philosophical divides that manifested during this period that I will touch on is the very fundamental disagreement about the nature of truth. The Germans believed that rationalism was weak and a bourgeois intellectual trap. They placed will and the embodied, inherent, biological, and metaphysical will above rationality. The Anglo-liberals, on the other hand, believed that rational inquiry was the only means to truth, a belief quite rooted within Enlightenment-era philosophy. The Soviets, on the other hand, believed that truth is an objective law of historical evolution discovered by Karl Marx, peace be upon him. Soviet science asserted that Marxism was the one objective truth, and that Marxism was the appropriate science to use in material and social inquiry. This touches on some divides that were fundamental disagreements in the ancient world, and to some extent during the medieval period. This is the difference between will, intellect, and materia. The Germans believed that will is truth. Now this may sound very alien and strange from the liberal framework that is used to dealing with Enlightenment rationality, but this has a very deep metaphysical basis. If one thinks in rather alchemical terms, consider the universe before material. What is necessary for God to create the material universe that we exist in? For something to come from nothing, this requires the will of God, reality willed into existence. And considering this idea, it's then extended that truth, that which is of God, is will. Will is ultimate reality, and therefore by extension humans too should consider will as primary in considerations of truth. Very often liberals look at this and get the idea that it's putting truth secondary to the German will, as in what the Germans want, as though they are saying that it's reasonable to lie or believe falsehoods in pursuit of German goals. But it's actually a much deeper metaphysical claim. The claim is that existence is because of will, and that will is truth. The liberals asserted that the understanding of truth could be pursued via the intellectual use of rationalism. This has another very deep metaphysical origin. Think within the Christian framework and the assertion that man is made in the image of God. What's contained within this isn't that God is bipedal and has hair, but that the capacity for free will, understanding, and intelligence was uniquely given to man, making him in God's image, unlike the animals. Christians have always had a very divided view when it comes to intellect, and Enlightenment-era philosophy pushed this argument quite firmly in one direction. Earlier Christian writers warned quite frequently about the dangers of intellect, and that it was all too easy for man to be enticed by the intellect. Enlightenment-era philosophy assumed that the world exists within God's order, and because man is made in the image of God, man is capable of understanding God's order. It would be asserted that humanity should use its rational intellect, that special spark that made man more like God, in order to understand this order, that the ability to use rational inquiry was a gift from God, in the way in which we should come to understand His creation. The Soviets, however, were atheistic and materialistic. Their consideration was entirely focused on material and economic constraints, operating under the assumption that all which was real was material. They would view everything through the lens of the fundamental conflict of material, that all which really mattered was the relationship between people and material. Therefore, ethics and material sciences could not be differentiated, as both existed within the same fundamental class struggle, the deep moral battle over economic resources. Back in Western Europe and the United States, there was a very interesting fracture beginning between Marxists. The Soviets held firm to this traditional Marxist, purely materialist way of thinking. Yet beginning initially in Germany, the Marxist Frankfurt School, Institute for Social Research under Karl Grünberg, would fall under the directorship of Max Horkheimer in 1930. At this time, many academics were beginning to deviate from traditional Marxist philosophy, though all were looking to the Soviet Union as the true testing ground and proof of the worldview. It wasn't that the Soviets were the boss of global Marxists. In fact, for decades, many of the actual intellectual leaders were in the West outside the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union was instead the test, the proof, and therefore very important to Marxists everywhere. Yet, under Horkheimer's Frankfurt School Institute, these Marxists would begin to develop something quite different. They would shift from the economic determinism of orthodox Marxism, creating instead an interdisciplinary framework, joining sociology, philosophy, and Freudian psychoanalysis. Horkheimer would begin to recruit academics Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and Leo Lowenthal, building what today is remembered as the Frankfurt School. The seed of this philosophical sphere is pretty well encapsulated in Horkheimer's 1931 inaugural address, a speech titled The Present Situation of Social Philosophy and the Tasks of an Institute for Social Research, because Marxists are insufferable with their word counts. These are the types of guys who would, instead of saying, "I got out of bed," say, "I elevated myself laterally, distancing myself from my sleeping apparatus." So if you're interested in taking a closer look at their philosophy, there's going to be a whole lot of words. In this speech, he would lay out the Frankfurt School framework, a melding of empirical social science, which is a bit oxymoronic, and philosophical critique. Now, critique, as it would transpire, is a very dense word. To the Frankfurt School theorists, it meant a sort of relentlessly tearing down at the Western belief set, such that all of its assertions and propositions would be rendered meaningless, creating the appropriate environment for a Marxist society. It's like someone relentlessly saying to you about absolutely everything you believe, "No, it's terrible. Nope, all fake. Nope, wrong, made up, all terrible. No, actually that sucks." And thus, they would go from Marxist orthodoxy and begin branching out into a plethora of social theories. Some examples would include the proposition that capitalism enforces reification, a process by which socially mediated notions become these functionally real illusions, in turn becoming commodities of the capitalist society, like believing that capital markets are natural, some sort of fundamentally real thing within human systems, something which has a metaphysical reality unto itself. They would argue that this was a method by which the workers were controlled, that they were being made to blind themselves to their own oppression. The Frankfurt School would pay a great deal of attention to media, arguing that the primary purpose for contemporaneous mass media was to create political docility within the proletariat, something which is a lot like bread and circuses, but with a whole lot more words. Yet, by extension, they would argue that art and aesthetics really only existed to perpetuate the capitalist system, that in the age of mass reproduction and proliferation, all that art and media was a way to keep the worker trapped, confused, and enslaved to the capitalist. Much of their thought began to take on Freudian qualities. They would argue that Western family structures enforced the authoritarian archetype, that family itself, specifically the nuclear family, imprinted the archetype of the authoritative father onto people, making them more susceptible to accept the authority of the capitalist system, something which would become the basis of their movement to get rid of nuclear families. Really, at its core, they were looking at pretty much all of the beliefs and systems within the West, and arguing that they existed to perpetuate this oppressive cycle, and to maintain the systems of control that bound down the lower classes. In turn, they would begin to interact with movements like feminism, certain ethnic and religious minority movements, and many movements of atypical and libertine sexuality, really believing that the order and morality of Western societies, the importance of the family structure, religious belief, social hierarchy and laws, the traditions of Western peoples, and really just the fundamental beliefs that people held had to be critiqued and thereby dismantled in order to bring about the liberation. By 1933, the German government had had enough. In many ways, they were the perfect enemy of the German state. They were communist Jews who supported things like eliminating religion, breaking down all moral structures, eliminating the family, destroying notions of men and women, advocating for homosexuality, group relationships, and really any form of sexuality so long as it wasn't normal, and really destroying everything about German society in order to bring about the Marxist utopia. This was not just a top-down fiat from the government. By this point, as Weimar had run its course and society had become so degraded, the presence of these elements was no longer welcome. People really did not want these movements within their society. And if you ever look at pictures of books being burned, it's this sort of thing. Yet, by 1934, the Frankfurt School would find a new home, taking up residence primarily in Columbia University in the United States. From there, over the following years, they would formalize critical theory, their core philosophical system, which is presented in Max Horkheimer's Traditional and Critical Theory. Ever since then, this intellectual lineage has been a part of not only American, but Western thinking at large. It would take many decades, but particularly beginning in the 1960s, intellectual descendants of this school would really latch on, particularly in elite universities, and would thereby slip into the minds of many of the elite, particularly those who went to elite universities, schools like the Ivy League universities and the crunchy rich kid private schools. And so this group would have quite an impact, particularly in the post-war era, something which I'm sure has become quite evident to everyone. We will certainly explore more of this intellectual trajectory later, yet as we continue on in the 1930s, we now have fundamental philosophical camps formalizing. We have American progressivist Rooseveltism, the new liberalism of the United States. We have a quite similar, though perhaps more conservative liberalism in the United Kingdom, one rooted in the liberal imperialism of the 19th century. We have the Volkish National Socialism of Germany. We have the statist absolutism of Fascist Italy. And we have the material communism of the Soviet Union, with a growing movement of splinter neo-Marxists growing particularly in the United States. Yet the Frankfurt School wouldn't be the only German intellectuals to be exiled during this era. In August of 1938, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Alexander Rostow would meet in Paris. These thinkers were primarily concerned with economics, and they would come to the conclusion that classical liberalism had died. Yet, unlike what was emerging across English civilization, they would as well reject Keynesianism, believing that it was a road to Marxist totalitarianism. In their meetings, the new term neoliberalism would be invented. They would be much more laissez-faire than the Keynesian progressivists, though they would reject total laissez-faire economics. They would argue that the state must police and protect price mechanisms and market competition from political interference, taking the position that for an actual free market to exist, there had to be some sort of overseer, someone who would keep powerful players from abusing it. This is a very interesting divide at the heart of liberal capitalism, one which today can be clearly illustrated in the deviation between libertarians and neoliberals. Both modern libertarians and neoliberals share many of the same origins. Over the years, neoliberals have come to accept many more Keynesian notions than those associated with the term back in the 1930s. Yet at their core, they come from the same place, a fundamental belief in markets and trade, drawing their core from Adam Smith's English free market philosophy. Yet the core difference is, how do you actually get a truly free market? If your goal is to have a free market, where the ability to freely exchange and the ability for unencumbered price discovery to be present, then how do you get there? What is the role of the state? Some believe that as entities like monopolies can arise, as informational asymmetries can create market inefficiencies, that there can be unscrupulous actors engaging in practices like price manipulation or the counterfeiting of goods, then there needs to be someone outside the market to police and protect the market. Yet others believe that this will inherently result in markets being manipulated, and the scales being tilted to some players over others. This much more purist camp believes that free markets will ultimately sort themselves out, as if all players are unencumbered and able to act in their best interests, then the natural pursuit of self-interest will create policing mechanisms within the markets organically. For example, groups of consumers will naturally police counterfeit goods. They believe that state involvement will by necessity create imbalances within the market, and that things like unnatural monopolies, booms and busts, and the ability for market participants to engage in manipulative practices sustainably are only possible when the state becomes involved. To use some examples from today, there wouldn't be absurd and predatory student loans if it weren't for the government involving itself in the issuance of student loans and creating the environment for this to be possible in the first place. Or that it wouldn't be possible for pharmaceutical companies to have such wildly high prices and to keep so much information from consumers if there weren't a regulatory apparatus advantaging some players over others and creating a gameable rule set. Ever since the Second World War, the United States has always leaned a little bit more Keynesian and regulatory, very much believing in the referee state, though the philosophies of figures like Hayek and Mises would certainly be quite influential throughout all of American history since. As the Second World War would near a close, many would turn their attention to the question of what the post-war world was going to look like. Many very deep questions had been put on hold during the war, and many had accepted some quite radical positions as being temporary wartime measures. Yet as it looked increasingly evident that the Allied powers were going to win, and were going to have the power to make the global order that would exist afterward, it became increasingly important to many to really get those fundamental philosophical questions figured out now. The core battle in the United States and Britain for post-war intellectual dominance was between the camp of Keynesians and Social Democrats. This way of thinking is well embodied in William Beveridge's Beveridge Report in 1942. He would describe the 5 great evils that society had a duty to address: want, disease, squalor, ignorance, and idleness. He would propose a cradle-to-grave welfare state, and this would become the basis of the welfare state in Britain following the war. The thinking was quite similar in the United States, though with its institutions growing out of Roosevelt's progressivism. In both the United States and Britain, the war effort required enormous government endeavors, and so very large state apparatuses had been constructed in order to complete such projects. Nearly all of society in the United States and Britain had been mobilized for the war, and in turn, increasingly, administrators were created in order to organize such large-scale endeavors. While it looked as though many of these institutions would be rolled back after the war when they were no longer necessary, it was becoming evident that the post-war governments of Britain and the United States would be far more bureaucratic, with much larger administrative systems. The administrative state was being born, and this was fundamentally changing the relationship between citizens and government. Under this Keynesian, progressive, social democrat nexus, these large bureaucratic apparatuses would be tasked with improving and regulating the lives of the people. The belief was now that a large government could improve people's lives. Unlike the technocratic elite of Woodrow Wilson's ideas, the administrative state progressivism would be much more dispersed, with vast institutions filled with the expert class, all with specialized bureaucrats operating the machine of state. As many believed that the goals of liberalism would be best fulfilled by administration and a large government capable of raising people up, the larger system of the state was becoming housed in administration, with local governments, the legislature, and indeed the presidency itself, all becoming subordinated to the system that perpetuated itself. Nobody truly running the government, but instead the system operating under its own systems. The system existing to perpetuate the system. Here the purpose of the administrative state was to exist, and to continue to exist, in so perpetuating itself, elevating all of society which existed within its purview. Others were horrified at this idea. In 1944, Friedrich Hayek would publish The Road to Serfdom, creating an emblematic encapsulation of this opposing view. He would argue that government economic planning would inevitably lead to tyranny by destroying price signals, though he was primarily concerned with the economic and market aspect of this enormous apparatus. Similar objections existed in other areas of society as well. Many were concerned that this new government was too large, that welfare states would inherently make people servile, making the state the most important thing in society, in turn making the United States and Britain much more like the fascist Italians than what they were before the war. And so, as the war was nearing an end, this was the fundamental divide. Just how present should the state be? Around the same time, delegates from the Allied nations would meet at Bretton Woods to discuss what the post-war monetary order would be. They would create a system where global currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and where the dollar would in turn be pegged to gold, with foreign central banks given the ability to convert dollars for gold. This new system was much more internationalist, with the belief being that the Allied powers, yet particularly the Anglo-American institutions, should act as overseers of global systems, that the world should be more global, that nations should meet and mediate their differences in order to avoid future wars, that the world should increasingly integrate via trade, and that the nations of the world should cooperate via global institutions. When combined with notions like tabula rasa, this new Anglo-American global order had made some enormous paradigm-changing assertions. In large part, this post-war global order's philosophy was a descendant of 19th century liberal imperialism, believing that liberal Britain should elevate the peoples of the world. Yet now, with this new system, the idea of the role of the nation itself was being fundamentally changed. To these thinkers, what mattered most were the global institutions and the global relationships. Many believe that one day there wouldn't need to even be countries at all, that through these global frameworks they could slowly engineer an end to nation-states. Many looked at the Axis powers and would make the vast assertion that belief in the nation, love of one's people, was what had caused all of the death and devastation. That if such catastrophe was to be averted in the future, then people would have to think globally, viewing everyone as part of some sort of global brotherhood, never caring too much about their own nation, and in fact, not even viewing yourself as part of a people at all. This was a very radical assertion, and it is what we have lived under ever since. The assertion being that if you care about your people, you are inherently excluding others. And since really we are all the same, made different only by material circumstance, and that which has been culturally imposed on us, then we are inherently acting out of hate, abusing others. That what is morally good is to forget about one's nation. That one should be a global citizen, thinking of oneself as no different from anyone else, and giving equal moral consideration to everyone of the world. This philosophy would emerge softer at first, though throughout the 20th century, and particularly into the 21st century, become increasingly purist and radical, reaching the point of functionally self-hatred and total rejection of one's own people. Yet at the time what had been formed was quite internationalist. This new era being embarked upon would lay its groundwork with international institutions like the United Nations and UNESCO. You would believe in foreign aid projects. You would believe in vast systems of treaties and trade entanglement. And thus, as the world emerged from the Second World War, the new international order would arise. And under the Anglo-American Allied victors, global liberalism was to be the world's dominant philosophy.